What has Finland gained from joining NATO and severing ties with Russia? Historically, relations between Finland and Russia have always been complex. During the era of the Grand Duchy of Finland, the Russian image among Finns was generally positive, as early Finnish identity was shaped in contrast to the dominant Swedish culture. However, after the fall of the Russian autocracy and Finland's subsequent independence, relations with its former metropole became openly hostile. This animosity peaked between 1918 and 1944 when differences between Finland and Russia were deliberately exaggerated for political reasons. The Finnish national identity project pursued two main objectives: first, to define Finland's place among other nations, and second, to unite the Finnish people against a common threat. For the Finns, this threat was the Soviet Union. After World War II, Russia's image in Finnish society became more neutral, primarily due to censorship of anti-Soviet content. Finland's neutrality was driven by the geopolitical situation, particularly during the Cold War. The closed borders did not help to reduce the psychological distance between the countries but rather contributed to the formation of stereotypical perceptions of one another. Following the collapse of the USSR, the historical hostility toward Russia did not disappear, although its intensity somewhat decreased. The local media played a role in maintaining these stereotypes about Russia and Russians, the most common and persistent element being the perception of Russia as a threat. The onset of the special military operation only reinforced these stereotypes about Russia and triggered a new wave of anti-Russian sentiment. As a result, the Finnish government not only decided to abandon its neutrality and join NATO but also severed economic ties with Russia and closed almost all border crossings. It is clear that the North Atlantic Alliance sought to maximize the benefits of the new geopolitical situation by expanding its presence with the addition of two new member states, Sweden and Finland, and getting closer to Russia's borders. But what, exactly, has Finland gained from this? What does NATO membership offer Finland? In the 2000s, Finland was considered a neighbor with whom maintaining a partnership was worthwhile, even if not entirely friendly. Formally, the Finns maintained neutrality, sticking to their old foreign policy orientation. However, in reality, they had long been turning toward the West and expanding cooperation, including with NATO. Discussions within Finnish political circles about the possibility of joining NATO had been ongoing long before Russia's special military operation in Ukraine began on February 24, 2022. This conversation started after the events of 2014. The escalation of confrontation between Russia and the West following the Ukrainian crisis further accelerated the erosion of Finland and Sweden's non-aligned status, as they increasingly engaged in joint military activities with NATO, including participation in military exercises such as Aurora, Baltops, and Cold Response. Nevertheless, the defining factor in the Finnish government's decision to join NATO was the onset of the military conflict in Ukraine. As some analysts note, had Russia not initiated the special operation in Ukraine, discussions about the advisability of joining NATO would likely have continued indefinitely in Stockholm and Helsinki. Finland could have used its formally neutral status to its advantage, though it was never fully neutral, but instead chose to become part of the North Atlantic Alliance. From a political and strategic standpoint, Finland neither loses nor gains anything significant. Finland's political orientation will remain the same as before. However, the room for political maneuvering will now be much smaller, as the country's level of sovereignty will undoubtedly decrease. If we talk about specifics, only the cluster that formed in border areas to serve tourists, primarily Russians, will be affected. A few years ago, the Finns attached great importance to this cluster. But now, they are closing the border with Russia on their own initiative, asserts Alexander Nosovich, the chief editor of the analytical portal Russia Baltic. From an economic perspective, Finland's losses have been far more significant, which we will discuss later, but from a political standpoint, there have indeed been no substantial changes for the Finns. Western media often claim that the Baltic Sea will now become an internal lake for NATO. While such statements are somewhat exaggerated, Russia's strategic position in the Baltic region has indeed worsened. New footholds for the deployment of NATO member state troops have emerged, and with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the alliance's ability to deliver military reinforcements to the Baltic states has improved. Moreover, there is now a threat of blockading the Gulf of Finland and Kaliningrad. But it is NATO and the United States that have likely benefited more from this than Finland itself. Economic consequences of severing ties with Russia. From an economic standpoint, the situation appears more complex. Sanctions against Russia have dealt a significant blow to the Finnish economy. Before the start of the Special Military Operation, SMO, several hundred Finnish companies were operating in Russia. Over the past 2 years, most of them have exited the Russian market. In early 2023, the Helsinki Stock Exchange estimated the losses of Finnish companies after their withdrawal from Russia at over €4 billion. In essence, Finland has shot itself in the foot. Additionally, Finland is suffering substantial losses in cruise tourism due to the sanctions. According to the Finnish newspaper Kauppalehti, the number of cruise ships arriving in Helsinki's ports has decreased by 70%. Furthermore, the lack of tourists has led to an increase in vacant commercial spaces in the city center. Shops and cafes are being forced to close due to the decline in customer traffic. Russian media often publish headlines suggesting that Finland is headed for financial collapse and depopulation, as seen in the article from the newspaper Vzglyad titled "Severing Ties with Russia is Depriving Finns of Money, Pensions, and Population." However, the situation in Finland is not yet as dire as these reports suggest. According to official data, unemployment in 2023 did not rise significantly, remaining at a relatively manageable 6.7%. Nevertheless, according to the Bank of Finland, the Finnish economy is in recession, and its recovery will be slow. In 2023, the GDP is expected to shrink by 0.5%. Private investments have noticeably declined due to a sharp increase in interest rates, rapidly rising business costs, and reduced demand, leading to decreased investment in non-residential real estate. Private consumption has also declined significantly in 2023. The labor market situation will worsen in 2024. The unemployment rate will rise to 7.8%, and while the employment situation will deteriorate, it will remain relatively favorable due to the persistent labor shortages in many sectors. The government budget deficit and national debt are increasing. The budget deficit relative to GDP rose to 1.6% in 2023 and is expected to continue increasing to around 3.5% by 2024 to 2026. States an analytical report on the bank's website. It is important to note that Finland's economic problems are not solely due to sanctions against Russia but are also linked to the broader challenges facing the global economy. However, the sanctions have exacerbated these issues and have had a particularly significant impact on the country. Finland is not the only country to have harmed its own interests with strict sanctions against Russia. However, in the current geopolitical landscape, political considerations sometimes outweigh economic and national interests, leading some countries to make decisions that run counter to their own best interests. Conclusion: Finland's accession to NATO undoubtedly diminishes its sovereignty in making critical political decisions, with most such decisions now likely to be made outside of Helsinki. However, the country's overall political orientation is expected to remain unchanged. Economically, Finland has suffered significant losses due to sanctions against Russia. The country has not only lost access to cheap raw materials and its competitive edge but also the Russian markets and the flow of Russian tourists. Additionally, Finland will now have to increase defense spending despite facing economic challenges, which will inevitably impact the standard of living for its population. However, reports of the country's economic collapse are somewhat exaggerated. The true consequences of the geopolitical shifts in the Baltic region, as correctly noted by Pavel Smirnov, a senior researcher at the Russian Academy of Sciences, will largely depend on the outcome of the military actions in Ukraine and the prospects for even a partial reduction in the level of military political tension between Russia and the West.